Calvin Reeves was 40 years old the morning he came downstairs to find his house emptied and divorce papers sitting on a kitchen counter that had been stripped of everything he recognized. She had taken the furniture, the framed prints from the living room, the contents of the joint account, the Lexus he drove on Sundays, and the black duffel he kept by the front door. She left the coffee maker, a single folding chair, and the faint outline pressed into the hardwood floor where the dining table used to stand, a ghost of the place they had built together over 7 years. Her name was Simone. She had a new attorney named Brendan Foyle and a new address 20 miles south in Ballantyne, and she had spent the better part of 3 months quietly moving their shared life out of that house, one Tuesday at a time, while Calvin sat at his desk reviewing contracts and telling himself the distance between them was something they could close. She told her friends he was just a government logistics man. Steady income, modest salary, nothing spectacular. She was ready to move on to something bigger. She had already started. What she transferred out of their joint accounts in the 72 hours before those papers hit the counter came to $380,000. What she did not know, what Brendan Foyle did not know, what none of the people settled comfortably into that Ballantyne house knew, was what Calvin Reeves had spent 14 years building in rooms that had nothing to do with the house she had stripped. The next morning, 12 black SUVs pulled up to her new address. She watched from the upstairs window. She did not yet understand what she was looking at. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. 3 months before the morning he found those papers, Charlotte was still holding on to the last warm days of October. Calvin Reeves sat at his home office desk at 5:45 in the morning with a cup of coffee and a contracts review that would have looked, to most people, like any other morning of paperwork. The desk was one he had built himself, solid walnut, mortise and tenon joints, finished with a dark oil that brought out the grain. He had built it the winter his mother died, working through the grief with his hands the way she had always told him to work through hard things, methodically, one piece at a time, without skipping steps. His mother, Hattie Reeves, had been gone 2 years. She had been a woman of few words and considerable precision, the kind of person who said a thing once and trusted you to carry it correctly. She used to say, in the even and unhurried voice she reserved for things she meant permanently, "Calvin, the man who knows where everything is, has nothing to fear from the man who doesn't." He had carried that sentence into every room he had entered professionally, and it had not yet failed him. Reeves Federal Logistics, the company Calvin had incorporated 14 years ago, held $43 million in active government contracts. It employed 61 people and operated from offices in Charlotte, Richmond, and Raleigh. The company's financial structure ran through an irrevocable business trust established before the marriage, advised by an accountant named Warren Shields and an attorney named Claudette Morris, both of whom had been with him since the beginning. Warren and Claudette knew everything. Simone knew he was in government logistics and that the work was steady. She had never asked to see the balance sheet, and he had never offered it, because she had never seemed particularly interested in the answer. A black leather portfolio lived in the top drawer of that walnut desk. Inside it were the original trust documents, signed and notarized, establishing the structure that governed every asset of substance he owned. It was the kind of document that never crossed the mind of a person who did not know what it would mean if they found it. He had met Simone Hartley at a fundraiser at the Charlotte Convention Center 6 years prior. She was in corporate event management, polished, graceful, with a way of making the room around her feel curated and intentional. He asked her one question near the end of the evening, and she gave him 3 answers, each more interesting than the last. He asked if she wanted dinner the following week. She said yes, on the condition that he tell her something true about himself first. He told her his mother had just been diagnosed with cancer. She reached across the table and took his hand without saying a word. That was what did it for him. The wordless reaching toward someone else's hard thing. They married 14 months later, in a ceremony his mother attended from a wheelchair, smiling the whole morning. The marriage had been steady for the first 3 years and gradually less so after that. Not in any single dramatic direction. But the way a sound structure still shows its age if you know where to examine it. Simone had stopped asking about his work. She spent more evenings out than her job required. Small things. He noted them. He said nothing. She was at the kitchen island that October morning when he came downstairs, phone in hand, thumb scrolling. She kissed his cheek. She mentioned a client meeting that afternoon that might run late. He offered coffee, and she said she already had some. She was wearing the kind of careful put-together that people assembled when they were going somewhere that mattered to them. Her phone was face down on the counter when she set it down. He noticed. He said nothing. 3 days later, a notification from their joint bank account arrived on his company phone at 6:47 in the morning. A transfer of $47,000 had been flagged for review. The bank wanted verbal confirmation before releasing the hold. Calvin set down his coffee. A man who moved without information, his mother used to say, moved in circles. He spent the better part of that next morning pulling 18 months of joint account history. The pattern was patient and deliberate. Small amounts first, 800 here, 1,200 there, moving through the account in increments calibrated to stay below the thresholds that generated automatic flags. Then larger amounts, spaced 30 days apart. Then, in the final 3 months, the pace accelerated. The week before the papers hit the counter, 5 transfers in 4 days had moved a combined $210,000 in chunks, each one positioned just below the reporting threshold. His hands did not shake. He worked the way he had always worked in 14 years of government contracting. Start at the beginning, don't skip steps, and document everything before you move. He printed the full 18-month statement. He built a spreadsheet with dates, amounts, and receiving account information where it was visible. He cross-referenced transfer timing against the shared calendar he and Simone had kept on their phones for 6 years, still accessible to him, access never revoked. The deposits aligned with 41 scheduled absences from the house, yoga evenings, work dinners, her sister in Greensboro, a conference in Raleigh that had lasted 3 nights when the actual event ran 2. He moved with the same deliberate calm that defined all his actions. By noon, he had documented a total of $418,000 moved through the joint account over 18 months, $380,000 in the final 72 hours and $38,000 in the earlier incremental transfers before that. He also confirmed what the bank had flagged. $95,000 of the final transfer had cleared from a federal contract payment direct deposited to the joint account 2 days prior. Federal contract funds transferred within 48 hours to an unaffiliated personal account. That specific detail carried a different category of legal implication than a domestic financial dispute. He sat with that information for a long moment. Then he called Warren Shields. Warren listened without interrupting for 4 full minutes. When Calvin finished, Warren said one thing. "Does Claudette know?" "I'm calling her next." "Call her now," Warren said. Claudette Morris answered on the second ring. She had already received something. Brendan Foyle's office had filed preliminary financial disclosures with the Mecklenburg County Court 3 days prior, disclosures required in a divorce proceeding to establish the value of marital assets. Claudette had been preparing to call Calvin about them when his call came through. She read from the filings. Foyle had listed the marital home, the joint account, and 3 investment accounts Calvin held in his personal name. Accounts funded through trust distributions, and categorized all of them as marital property with a combined stated value of $2 million. He had not listed the business trust itself. He did not appear to know it existed. He had, however, included a list of alleged business liabilities attributed to Calvin. Debts Foyle claimed reduced the value of Calvin's assets by $340,000. Calvin did not recognize a single line item on the list. The named creditors were entities he had never heard of. He fabricated liabilities, Claudette said, with the measured tone of a woman who had seen this before and found it equally unacceptable every time. He is trying to shrink your side of the ledger while inflating his client's entitlement claim. That is not aggressive lawyering, Calvin. That is fraud on the court. Calvin opened the top drawer of the walnut desk. He took out the black leather portfolio and set it on the desk in front of him. He doesn't know about the trust, Calvin said. No, Claudette said. He doesn't. A pause settled on the line between them. And the federal funds transfer? Calvin asked. That, Claudette said carefully, is not a matter for family court. We will handle it through the appropriate channels, on its own timeline. He looked at the portfolio for a long moment, and then he picked up his phone and called Warren back, and told him to begin making the necessary notifications. His voice quiet, and entirely even. And when he hung up, he sat in his office in a building Simone had never visited, and looked at the desk he had built with his own hands, and thought about what his mother had told him about patience. Not the passive kind, but the kind that worked. Some things only work, she used to say, when you are ready to use everything you have. The following week moved at a pace only Calvin could see. On Monday morning, he sat across from Claudette Morris in her uptown Charlotte office, 18th floor, city view, documents spread between them, annotated in red. Claudette had been practicing family and business law for 31 years. She examined complicated situations the way a structural engineer examined a building, always for the load-bearing components, always for the fractures hiding beneath the finished surfaces. Foyle made 2 errors, she said. The first was not knowing about the trust. The second was fabricating liabilities to compensate for the financial gap he could not otherwise explain. The 3 creditor entities he listed are single-member South Carolina LLCs, all formed within the past 18 months, all sharing the same registered agent address, none with any operating history or verifiable accounts. He has done this before. She set her pen down flat. He has not done it to someone with documentation like yours. Can he reach the trust assets? The trust predates the marriage by 6 years. Nothing was commingled at the entity level. He has no viable claim. She paused briefly. The investment accounts are the only arguable area. Our position is that trust distributions received and held in a personal account became separate property upon receipt. The case law in this state supports that clearly. And the federal compliance matter? That activates on its own timetable, Claudette said. It will not be a quiet process. He drove from her office across the city to the east side, to a townhouse with a well-kept lawn, and a small American flag mounted beside the door. Charles Odom, retired Brigadier General, United States Army, now a senior advisory board member of Reeves Federal Logistics, answered before the second knock. Odom had been Calvin's commanding officer at Fort Bragg 20 years earlier and remained one of 4 people whose calls Calvin returned without checking the time. Odom poured coffee. He did not ask unnecessary questions. The final transfer included federal contract proceeds, Calvin said. $95,000. I know what that means, Odom said. I need to understand the response mechanism. Odom set his mug down. Once the notification goes to the contracting office, the compliance structure activates. Auditors, legal review, oversight documentation, process servers for the civil action. It runs parallel to family court. You don't control the pace. He paused. How many vehicles does a coordinated service action of that scope typically involve? Odom looked at him for a measured moment. The corner of his mouth moved, barely, in a full compliance response. Between legal, federal, and service teams? He considered it with the unhurried patience of a man who had planned operations on larger scales than this. A dozen. Give or take. Calvin nodded once and said nothing further. He drove back through the city with the window down, thinking about something his mother had told him when he was 7 years old, and trying to carry too many pieces of firewood at once. She had said, Calvin, 1 trip done right is worth 3 trips done fast. He had applied that to every operation he had ever run. By Wednesday, Claudette's investigative team had built the background profile on Brendan Foyle that changed the dimensions of the picture considerably. He was 47, 14 years in family and civil practice, recently appointed to a local housing advisory board. He was also the subject of a prior state bar complaint filed 2 years earlier, alleging that he had coached a client to misrepresent asset values in a divorce proceeding, pressured the opposing party into an undervalued settlement, and collected a percentage-based referral fee that constituted an undisclosed conflict of interest. The complaint had been resolved privately. A reprimand, a fine, no public sanction. A quiet resolution that left the pattern undisturbed. He had done this before. He had done it more carefully before. This time, he had done it against the wrong man's portfolio. Calvin spent Thursday at his Charlotte office in the ordinary way, reviewing contracts, approving a subcontractor proposal for the Richmond division, taking calls from Warren about the quarterly distribution schedule. He sent Simone a brief and businesslike text informing her that his attorney had received the preliminary disclosures and would be in contact with opposing counsel. She read it and did not respond for 2 hours. When she did, her reply was 4 words: "My attorney will respond." He set his phone face down on the desk. He ate lunch. He reviewed the quarterly numbers. He sat in his office in a building she had never visited, and he thought about what his mother had told him once about the difference between patience and inaction, and how the people who could not tell the two apart were always the ones who got caught flat-footed when the prepared man moved. She believed she had already won. She was making plans from that belief, furnishing the Ballantine house, choosing paint, conducting herself as a woman who had made the correct move and was simply waiting for the legal formalities to confirm it. She had no idea. Preparation was not waiting. Preparation was work. There had always been a difference, and it had always been the only difference that mattered. The Saturday began quietly at the house in Ballantine. It was a corner property on a residential street, newly purchased, still carrying the faint smell of fresh paint and new carpet, the kind of house that announced a fresh start to anyone who passed by. Simone had chosen it herself. The transaction had been structured through one of Brendan Foyle's affiliated entities, pending the resolution of her financial position. She had moved in 6 weeks prior, and arranged the rooms with the deliberate attention of someone settling into something she believed she had earned. She was at the kitchen island with coffee at 9 in the morning when the first black SUV turned the corner. Then the second. Then 3 more in close succession. Brendan saw them from the front window. He set his mug down with a controlled, careful movement. He watched the vehicles slow and position themselves in a staggered line along the front of the property. 2 at the curb, 1 at the edge of the driveway, 2 more along the parallel access road. He counted. Then he stopped counting. A woman in a dark blazer stepped out of the second vehicle, federal compliance insignia visible on her credentials, followed by two people carrying document cases. A process server in a lanyard exited the third vehicle with a sealed envelope. From the fourth, Claudette Morris emerged, composed and entirely unhurried, a leather folio under her arm. Warren Shields stepped out of the vehicle behind hers. From the first vehicle, Calvin Reeves stepped out last. He was wearing a gray suit and shoes that made no sound on the front path. He walked without hurry, the way he walked into every room he had ever entered, with full preparation behind him. He reached the front door at the same moment Brendan Foyle opened it, as if the timing had been engineered, because it had. The two men looked at each other without speaking for a moment. Brendan said, "This is not how this process works." "I know how it works," Calvin said. His voice was even and conversational. "That's why we're here." Claudette stepped up beside him. "Mr. Foyle, you are being served with a counterfiling responding to your client's financial disclosures, documents submitted to the Mecklenburg County Court under penalty of perjury, which contain materially fraudulent representations." She extended the first sealed package. "You are also receiving notice of a North Carolina State Bar complaint filed this morning, citing the prior private reprimand and the current filing as evidence of a pattern of conduct." She extended the second document. "And this is the federal compliance notification related to the government contract funds included in the joint account transfer. That matter will proceed on its own timeline." Foyle took the documents the way a man takes things he already knows he is going to have to put down. He said nothing. Simone appeared at the top of the entry stairs. She was dressed for what she expected Saturday to be. She had not expected this. Not the vehicles, not the people with cases, not the woman from the federal compliance office writing on a clipboard in her own driveway. Not Calvin standing at the foot of her front steps looking at her with the same steady expression she had seen on his face the night he told her his mother was sick and did not flinch once. She looked at him for a long moment. "You didn't have to do all of this," she said. Her voice had lost its earlier certainty. "You told your friends I had nothing," Calvin said. "I wanted to make sure you saw everything at once." Something moved across her face. The beginning of an appeal, the instinctive reach for the emotional register that had worked on him before. The language of shared history and the suggestion that it did not have to go this way. He spoke before it arrived. "The trust was established 6 years before we met. It protected everything it was designed to protect. The funds you transferred are subject to full recovery. The disclosures Brendan filed are now a matter of permanent court record." He held her gaze with the quiet steadiness of a man who had already finished what he came to do. "You didn't leave me with nothing, Simone. You left me with exactly what I built." He looked at Brendan Foyle one last time. "Claudette will be in contact about the timeline." He turned and walked back down the front path without looking behind him. The morning was clear and cool, and the street was quiet, except for the sound of document cases being set down and the measured, unhurried work of people who knew exactly what they were there to do. He passed the row of vehicles without stopping and kept walking to the corner, where his own truck was parked, the same F-150 with 112,000 miles that he had always driven, paid in full, every mile his own. She had no idea. Not on the morning she left, and not on the morning she watched from that upstairs window. The man she believed she had reduced to nothing had spent 14 years making certain there was nothing left to reduce. He drove. 6 months later, Calvin Reeves was on the back porch of a house he had purchased in Plaza Midwood, a 1940s bungalow on a corner lot that he had spent 3 weekends repairing alongside a contractor he trusted. The porch faced east. In the mornings, the light came over the roofline of the house next door and landed first on a garden bed he had put in the week he moved. Tomatoes heavy on the vine. 2 rows of green beans climbing their wire supports with a patience he respected. Basil coming in thick along the near edge. The walnut desk was in the study now, in its proper place. The black leather portfolio still lived in the top drawer. The divorce had been finalized 11 weeks prior. The counter-filing had established the trust's pre-existing status without meaningful contest. The fabricated liability entities had been unwound in court filings that became public record. A judgment for the full $380,000 transfer had been entered. The federal compliance review was ongoing. That was not Calvin's business to manage at this point. Brendan Foyle's bar complaint had advanced to a formal hearing. His license was under a 90-day suspension pending the outcome, and the prior private reprimand was now part of the public record. 2 former clients had filed civil suits. The Housing Advisory Board had accepted his resignation by letter the same week the suspension was announced. Simone was living in a rental in South Charlotte, working in event coordination at a mid-tier hotel downtown. Her closest friend from their marriage years, a woman named Diana, who had been in the wedding, had not returned a call in 4 months. Her mother had called Calvin once, simply to say she was sorry for what had been done to him. He had thanked her and said he hoped the family was well. He meant it. He heard the rest through Warren, who heard things through channels Calvin did not need to monitor personally. He received the information the way he received weather reports for cities he was not traveling to. Noted. Filed. Moved on. There was a woman named Renata in his life now. She was a civil engineer, mid-30s, and she asked questions the way engineers asked questions, precisely, with genuine interest in the actual answer. On their 3rd evening together, she had asked him what the hardest part of the past year had been. He had considered the question for a full breath before answering. "Not the money," he said. "The recalibration of what I thought I knew about a person." She had nodded slowly, as if she had taken the answer somewhere and set it down carefully, without rushing to respond. He had liked that about her considerably. The company had grown. A new federal contract signed the previous month had expanded the Richmond operation to its largest scale yet. He had brought on 2 junior managers from the west side of Charlotte and spent his Friday afternoons teaching them what he knew about building something designed to last. The patience required, the records you kept, the difference between looking capable and being prepared. On a Tuesday morning in late spring, Calvin sat on the east-facing porch with his coffee going cool in his hand and watched the garden come into the early light. The tomatoes had gone heavy. The beans had climbed all the way to the top of the wire and were beginning, with characteristic indifference to anything but their own growth, to spill back over the other side. Everything was taking exactly the time it needed. He had never needed her to understand what he was. He only needed to be it. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.